Welcome back, everyone. We have a seriously fascinating explainer lined up for you today. We're going to take a thrilling dive into a piece of history that honestly reads exactly like a corporate true crime story. We're talking about the astonishing reach of multinational corporations, the wild origins of some political terms you definitely know, and the unbelievable lengths one specific company went to just to protect its bottom line. So get ready, because the history of your morning banana is a whole lot darker than you probably think. Okay, let's dive into this. Could a fruit company actually start a war? I mean, it sounds like a wild question, right? Could a company that literally just sells bananas engineer the overthrow of a sovereign government? Well, to understand how this isn't just possible, but absolutely happened, we have to travel back to the first half of the 20th century and look at an absolute business behemoth known as the United Fruit Company. Now, we've all heard the term banana republic, and today you might just associate it with the clothing store at your local mall, but its origins are intensely dark and very, very literal. It defines a tropical country where growing bananas is naturally favorable, sure, but more importantly, it's where a foreign multinational company achieves this immense, completely disproportionate influence over the actual government. This term was essentially coined to describe the exact environments created by our central subject today, the United Fruit Company. Section 1. The Birth of the Banana Republic. The Rise of El Pulpo. Now, what's really interesting about this is just the sheer scale of it all. By the mid-20th century, the United Fruit Company was completely unrivaled. In fact, locals gave them an ominous nickname, El Pulpo, which means the octopus. And it was because their tentacles literally reached into every single aspect of life in Central America, particularly in Guatemala. Just look at this staggering monopoly. They didn't just grow bananas. They owned over 40% of Guatemala's arable land. And get this, they kept most of it completely fallow, just unused, simply to limit any potential competition. But it doesn't stop there. They controlled the railroads, meaning they dictated the transport of all goods. They owned the shipping routes with their Great White Fleet. They even held total rights to the country's telecommunications. So you have an entire sovereign state effectively at the absolute mercy of a corporate board sitting thousands of miles away.
Moving on to Section 2. The threat of Decree 900, a tax dodge backfires.
And this brilliantly illustrates where things start to come crashing down for El Pulpo. So in the 1950s, Guatemala holds a democratic election, and a reform-minded president named Jacobo Arbenz comes to power. He looks at the massive social inequalities in his country, and he introduces an ambitious land reform program known as Decree 900. The goal? Expropriate uncultivated land and redistribute it to landless peasants. Now, under the law, the government legally had to compensate the United Fruit Company for taking this land. But the big question was, how much do you pay them? Well, in a stroke of absolute brilliant irony, Arbenz decided to pay them based on the exact land values the company had been declaring on their own tax forms for years. Because the company had been severely undervaluing their land to illegally dodge Guatemalan taxes, they were compensated mere pennies on the dollar compared to what they claimed the land was actually worth. Their own massive tax dodge completely backfired.
Which brings us to Section 3. The father of spin, engineering a fake threat.
Obviously, the United Fruit Company wasn't about to just sit back and accept this. They needed to fight back, but they couldn't exactly go to the press and say, hey, we want our unfair monopoly back. They needed a spin. Enter Edward Bernays. He's widely known as the father of public relations, though his critics often called him the father of lies. Bernays actually started out pioneering advertising techniques for the tobacco industry. And as his quote here shows, to him there was no objective truth. Reality was just clay to be molded for corporate interests. He believed people's wants and fears could be entirely shaped and engineered. So naturally, the United Fruit Company hired him to completely rewrite the narrative around what was happening in Guatemala. Let's examine his playbook here, because it is incredibly sophisticated and highly manipulative. First, Bernays creates a front organization. He literally makes up the Middle America Information Bureau and uses it to feed corporate-approved, biased information to thousands of American journalists. Step 2, he organizes these lavish, all-expenses-paid, highly curated trips to Central America for reporters from major outlets like the New York Times and Time magazine. He controlled exactly what they saw and who they spoke to. And third, this is the real masterstroke. He took a localized domestic land reform issue and aggressively framed it as a dangerous Soviet communist beachhead forming right in America's backyard. Now, keep in mind, there was a distinct lack of evidence of any actual Soviet control in Guatemala at the time, but Bernays capitalized on peak Cold War fears. He agitated the U.S. public and he played U.S. policymakers perfectly. Let's move to and see how this builds into Section 4, Engineering a Fake War, Operation PB Success. With the American public sufficiently terrified, and key officials, many of whom actually had direct financial ties to United Fruit, by the way, completely convinced of this manufactured threat, President Dwight D. Eisenhower gave the green light. He authorized the CIA to take covert action. This was codenamed Operation PB Success. And what's wild here is that the CIA essentially took a page directly out of Bernays' PR playbook. Utilizing intense psychological warfare directed by a guy named David Atlee Phillips, who was an ex-actor, fittingly enough, they set up a completely fake radio station called the Voice of Liberation. Through this, they broadcast totally fabricated disinformation. We're talking absurd stuff. They claimed troops were moving when they weren't, they spread rumors that the Guatemalan president and his wife were antichrists, and they even broadcast fake warnings that Lake Atitlan had been poisoned. All of this was happening while they armed and supported a relatively tiny force of exiles to march toward the capital.
Looking at how this played out, you can really see how rapidly a country can be completely destabilized through pure misinformation. By early 1954, those fake radio broadcasts were causing absolute mass hysteria on the ground. Even though the actual invading force, led by a man named Castile Armas, was small and really poorly equipped, the CIA used their radio networks to present it as this massive, overwhelming popular revolution. They were even feeding tailored fake imagery of the conflict straight to American broadcasters. And the psychological pressure completely worked. On June 27, 1954, President Arbenz resigned. In a jammed final radio broadcast, he directly stated that the United Fruit Company and U.S. monopolies were responsible for his downfall.
Section 5. Echoes of the Octopus. From UFC to modern non-state actors. So the crucial point is that Arbenz was out, but United Fruit's big triumph? It was actually remarkably short-lived. The company eventually faced massive antitrust investigations back in Washington and was ultimately dismantled. But their legacy definitely lived on. $25 million. That is the massive fine paid in 2007 by a company you might actually recognize, Chiquita Brands. Chiquita is the modern successor to the United Fruit Company, and they paid this fine to the U.S. government because it came to light that they had been funding right-wing paramilitaries in Colombia between 1997 and 2004. So even decades later, this pattern of corporate intervention in foreign nations didn't just disappear. And honestly, when we compare 1954 to today, the parallels are pretty chilling. Back in '54, the United Fruit Company manipulated the media and leveraged their massive infrastructure monopoly to literally topple a government. Today, scholars point to massive modern non-state actors operating with incredibly similar geopolitical power. Take 2017 in Myanmar, for example. A non-state actor, Facebook, propelled hate speech through its algorithms, which directly contributed to real-world atrocities across borders. Or you can look at the modern fast fashion industry, which dictates labor conditions, evades legal minimum wages, and severely impacts human rights across developing nations like Bangladesh and Indonesia. The tools have certainly changed. We're talking algorithms and global supply chains now, instead of railroads and telegraphs. But that immense, borderline imperialistic power, it remains a huge factor on the global stage. Which brings us to our final thought for today's explainer. The United Fruit Company may have been broken up, and the Cold War might be over, but as we've seen, the blueprint for corporate geopolitical influence is still very much alive and kicking. So I want to leave you with this question to ponder. Did the era of the Banana Republic ever truly end? Or has the octopus simply learned to wear a new disguise? Thank you so much for focusing in with us today. Always keep questioning the hidden history behind the everyday items in your life, and we will catch you next time.